The fluorescent lights at Oak Creek Memorial hummed like they were counting down to something catastrophic. Ashley Cooper moved through the pre-dawn corridors of the cardiac wing with the kind of silence that made people forget she was there, which was precisely how she preferred it. The scrubs hung on her frame without distinction, navy blue, standard issue, indistinguishable from 100 other nurses cycling through the San Diego Trauma Center's night shift. Nobody looked twice. Nobody ever did. Her badge clattered softly against her sternum as she checked the patient board outside room 347. Lance Corporal Marcus Hayes. 28 years old. Admitted through emergency 6 hours ago with acute cardiac complications secondary to shrapnel migration. The clinical summary was efficient and sterile. Embedded metal fragments from a vehicle-borne IED were shifting against the pericardial sac, restricting heart function, creating pressure where expansion should exist. The chart noted minimal pain medication orders, morphine 2 mg for every 4 hours, nothing more, nothing prophylactic, which meant someone upstairs had decided this patient's suffering was acceptable collateral damage to the goal of avoiding addiction liability. Ashley's jaw tightened. She'd seen the logic before. She'd fought it before. And she would fight it again. She entered the room with practiced quietness, the kind of entrance that didn't announce itself. Hayes was awake, staring at the hospital ceiling with a glassy 1,000-yard stare of someone whose body was currently orchestrating its own betrayal. His breathing was shallow. Compensatory. The skin at his temples glistened with sweat even though the room temperature read 71 degrees. His vitals confirmed what his face was broadcasting: blood pressure elevated, heart rate accelerating, oxygen saturation dropping in incremental degrees like a building leak no one wanted to acknowledge. And there, on his right chest, a tattoo. Bold black ink. A stylized numeral 2 with battalion markings underneath. 2nd Battalion. The same unit designation that Ashley touched every morning before her shift, sewn into the lining of her jacket in faded thread, a patch that had survived 18 years of washing and wearing and the accumulated weight of everything she was not allowed to say. "Good morning, Lance Corporal," she said. Not Hayes. Not Mr. Hayes. His rank. Because she understood that for military personnel, the rank was the only identity that mattered anymore. Everything else was civilian noise. Hayes's eyes shifted to her. Recognition flickered somewhere behind the pharmaceutical haze and the pain. She didn't acknowledge it. She moved to his for line with a kind of efficiency that left no room for sentiment. Her hands, scarred beneath the cuffs of her scrubs, mapping stories in scar tissue that would take classified security clearance to explain, checked the drip rate, verified the line placement, and assessed his peripheral perfusion with the clinical detachment of someone who had performed these assessments in sandstorms where the wind carried the smell of diesel and copper and things that didn't have names. "When's the last time you received pain medication?" she asked, already knowing the answer because she'd read his chart 3 times before walking through the door, each time her concern calcifying into certainty. 4 hours ago, Hayes said. His voice was steady but the effort showed in the muscles around his jaw. "Small dose." Doctor said. "That's going to change," Ashley said. She didn't smile. She didn't promise anything. She simply documented her clinical observation in his chart with handwriting so precise it looked like it had been drafted by a machine, patient presenting with elevated vitals consistent with inadequate pain management. Recommend reassessment of current analgesic protocol. Shrapnel migration to pericardium warrants aggressive pain mitigation to reduce cardiac workload and prevent compensatory tachycardia. Recommend morphine 4 mg for every 3 hours with additional dosing available on patient request. She signed it with her initials, AC. Just initials. Nothing that would tie the recommendation to any particular person's ego or history or the classification files that had been buried so deep the military had officially erased her existence 20 years ago and sworn her to silence under penalties that made criminal sentencing look like a parking ticket. The doors to the cardiac wing opened at 7:15. The day shift began its slow infiltration through the corridors. Ashley was finishing her charting in the break room, a space that smelled like stale coffee and the chemical aftermath of overnight fluorescent lighting, when she heard the door open behind her. She didn't look up. She already knew who it was. She could tell by the particular weight of his footsteps, the way his shoe leather announced authority before his mouth did. Dr. Marcus Hargrove entered like he was arriving at his own coronation. 52 years old. Surgical degree from Johns Hopkins. Board certified in cardiology at 34. The kind of resume that convinced him that every room he entered had been waiting for his presence. He wore a white coat that had probably cost more than Ashley's monthly rent and carried her chart like it was a personal affront. Ashley. Not Ms. Cooper. Not Cooper. Just the first name, delivered with the kind of informality that was actually complete contempt. I saw your note in the Hayes file. Ashley set down her coffee with deliberate calm. The mug was ceramic, ordinary, the kind of thing that didn't warrant notice. She turned to face him with the kind of composure that came from having survived situations where one facial muscle out of place could get you extracted by drone strike or rendered to a black site or simply disappeared into the institutional machinery of government agencies that didn't officially exist. His vitals indicate insufficient pain management, she said. Her voice was even. Clinical. The kind of voice that didn't invite argument. Shrapnel migration to the pericardium creates cardiac load stress. Inadequate analgesia elevates heart rate and blood pressure, which compounds the load. The math is elementary. The math, Hargrove said, and his voice had that particular texture of condescension reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him, is my responsibility. Not yours. He stepped closer. The cologne was aggressive, expensive, designed to announce presence in a room the same way his salary announced superiority. You're a nurse, Ashley. Not a physician. And when you start making clinical recommendations that contradict my orders, you're not advocating for the patient. You're overstepping your scope. You're creating liability. You're being insubordinate. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical humming. Somewhere down the hall, a heart monitor beeped its steady electronic prayer. In room 347, Lance Corporal Marcus Hayes was still breathing shallow, still sweating, still experiencing pain that someone had decided was acceptable because the alternative involved confronting the possibility of addiction or, worse, the inconvenience of a patient who healed better when they weren't suffering. Ashley took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from years of tactical training, from learning that composure was a weapon that worked in inverse proportion to its visibility. She let herself absorb what he'd said the way she'd learned to absorb everything, like enemy fire, with controlled breathing and absolute stillness. Then something shifted in her chest, not trembling, not fear, but a single tear that escaped like water from a precisely compromised levee. She didn't wipe it immediately. She let it track down her face while maintaining complete eye contact, her shoulders never shifting, her breathing never stuttering. Lance Corporal Hayes deserves better than this, she said. The words were quiet. They were firm. They were the only thing she said, and they filled the break room like silence had texture. Hargrove's face shifted colors the way a chameleon adapts to its environment, red arriving first, then something darker, something that might have been fury or might have been fear that someone was refusing to accept his authority. He turned and left without responding, which was a response in itself. Ashley wiped her face without looking away from the space where he'd been standing. Her coffee was still warm. She picked it up and drank it in one measured sequence, each swallow deliberate, each movement controlled. The mask stayed in place. The protocol held. The code remained unbroken. When she emerged from the break room, she noticed the shift in temperature that only people trained in threat assessment can detect. The nurses at the station, people she'd worked with for 4 years, people she'd covered shifts for, people she'd trained on new cardiac protocols, suddenly seemed very focused on their computer screens. The conversation that had been happening 5 seconds before her arrival had simply ceased, as if she'd walked into a room where the power had been cut. Sarah, who usually greeted her with gossip about the vending machine romance that had somehow developed between day shift residents, looked down at her keyboard like it contained the secrets of the universe. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody sat near her. The social temperature of the cardiac wing had shifted with the subtlety of a glacier moving, invisible in its moment-by-moment progression, but catastrophic in its accumulated weight. Ashley moved through the remainder of her shift with the same silence that had preceded the confrontation. She checked vitals. She documented observations. She ensured that every protocol was followed with such mechanical precision that there was no possible ground for criticism. She was, in every objective measure, exactly the nurse she'd been before the break room had become a battleground, competent, efficient, invisible. But something had changed. Everyone could feel it. Something about the way she moved now suggested she was no longer a person who could be humiliated. Something in her bearing suggested that whatever had triggered that single tear was not weakness. It was restraint. And restraint, when deployed by someone with nothing left to lose, is more dangerous than rage. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and broken trust. Ashley pushed through the door at 1,400 hours, lunch container in hand, and watched the room empty like someone had called a fire alarm. Dr. Patel closed his laptop mid-email. Nurse Martinez suddenly remembered a patient who needed her. The respiratory therapist who'd asked for her clinical notes last month stood up without making eye contact and left. Within 90 seconds, the table where Ashley used to discuss Hayes's care protocol was empty except for her. She unwrapped her sandwich. Turkey and mustard. The kind of thing a normal nurse ate on a normal day. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm above her, indifferent to the fact that she was now radioactive. Colleagues avoided her the way radiation itself works, not with intention, but with physics. Get too close and something bad happens. The isolation was strategic. Hargrove had weaponized the break room, the only place staff gathered without patients present. Take away a nurse's peers and you take away her voice. No one questions a doctor's diagnosis when the nurse who might have defended him is eating lunch alone in a fluorescent tomb. Ashley touched the patch sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden where Hargrove couldn't see it. The 2nd Battalion insignia. Same unit as Hayes's tattoo. The patch had survived 2 decades, 3 wars, and a Pentagon order so classified that officially she didn't exist. It would survive this too. But watching it happen, watching people she'd trained in critical thinking deliberately stop thinking when she was in the room, that required a different kind of strength. She finished her sandwich in silence. Friday morning arrived with her name on the disciplinary board in the main hallway. Cooper, A. Written warning for insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. The document was laminated, official, permanent in the way hospital bureaucracy makes things permanent. Staff members passing the bulletin board slowed their pace when they saw her reading it. Not to support her. To see if she would break. Dr. Hargrove stood near the nurse's station with his morning coffee, watching, waiting for something to crack in her composure. A tremor. A voice raised in protest. A nurse who finally lost control so he could point and say, "See, she's unstable." Ashley read the document once. Took one measured breath. Adjusted her stethoscope. And walked back to work without saying a word. That silence infuriated him more than tears ever could. By afternoon, Hargrove had locked himself in his office for 3 separate phone calls. The first was to Hospital Administrator Dr. Sterling, who controlled the disciplinary process. The second was to Dr. Conrad, the chief of the medical staff. The third was to Dr. Bennett, the board member who'd actually signed off on the warning. Each call lasted exactly 7 minutes. Each one mentioned patient safety concerns and a nurse who's becoming a liability, and I'm not sure she's fit for this unit. What Hargrove didn't mention was that Ashley's clinical documentation on Hayes was flawless. That her notation about inadequate pain management was exactly the kind of informed advocacy that defined elite nursing. That she was the only person on his unit with the expertise to catch what he was actually doing. Because that's when the phantom billing had started. Small at first. A charge for 5 milligrams of fordelorded on a terminal patient's file, medication administered, receipt logged, patient memory fuzzy with end-of-life sedation. Who would verify? The family's grateful. The patient's already declining. The insurance company paid automatically. By week 2, Hargrove had expanded it. Different drugs, different patients, inflated quantities. Morphine doses that never entered anyone's veins. fentanyl patches applied to charts instead of skin. The money flowed quietly into the hospital's accounts, and from there into darker channels Hargrove had cultivated over a decade. Thousands of dollars weekly. A scheme that worked because everyone assumed the doctors were honest. Until a senior chief petty officer had started asking questions about a Marine's pain protocol. Day 3 after the board notice, Ashley moved through the hospital like a ghost who'd forgotten she was dead. Colleagues who'd once asked her opinion on difficult cases now looked away when she approached. The nurses who'd requested her mentorship on complex catheter placements suddenly managed on their own. The respiratory therapist stopped leaving her notes about patients she might want to check on. Hargrove had built his isolation with precision. Not crude, not obvious, surgical. Each gesture of coldness came from someone afraid to be on the wrong side of a powerful doctor. Self-preservation is a powerful anesthetic. It numbs people to the injustice they're committing. She'd seen this before. Different uniforms, same mechanics. In Kandahar, when someone got too close to the truth, the organization buried them quietly. Not with violence, with absence. With the slow erasure that comes when everyone stops speaking your name. The difference was that in Kandahar, she was the one doing the erasing. She had the authority. She had the order signed by someone 3 levels above her pay grade. She had the Pentagon backing and the classified operation and the mandate to protect the unit by any means. Here, she was just a nurse. 3 years on record. No military background listed. No evidence of what she actually was, because officially she'd never been anything at all. She touched the patch again at 1,600 hours while sitting in a supply closet, not hiding, just needing a moment where no one expected her to be normal. The fabric was soft from 2 decades of handling. Worn. The blue and gold had faded to something closer to ash. This patch had been sewn inside her jacket lining when she was something that mattered. When her decision saved lives and the people around her knew it. Now it was contraband. Hidden. Her greatest accomplishment, pulling an 8-year-old Marine out of a burning Humvee in Helmand Province, keeping him alive until the medevac arrived, watching him grow up to enlist in the Corps because he'd already learned what survival meant. Now it was a secret that could end her cover. By day 6, Hayes was moved to ICU. His cardiac function was declining. Fluid was accumulating around his heart in a slow, methodical drowning. Hargrove's new orders restricted all procedures to physician-only authorization, a directive that might as well have been tattooed on Ashley's forehead. Don't help. Don't intervene. Don't let your expertise interfere with my authority. She arrived for the night shift at 1900 hours and went directly to Hayes's room. He was awake, watching the monitors with the focus of someone who'd already learned to read the language of their own body failing. His parents sat in the corner. His daughter, 8 years old, same age he'd been when Ashley found him in that burning vehicle in Helmand Province, carried a pink backpack and asked why the nice nurse didn't come in anymore. Hayes's father said something about hospital politics that Ashley heard 3 doors down while inventorying the crash cart supplies. She kept her hands moving. Gloves. Medications. The equipment of hope. Close enough to hear. Far enough to obey the invisible boundaries Hargrove had drawn around her. The monitor alarm changed pitch at 2,340 hours. Not the casual rhythm of normal decline. The sharp, accelerating pattern of a heart running out of time. Ashley's head snapped up with recognition that had nothing to do with 3 years of civilian nursing school. This was muscle memory. This was the part of her that had run a classified combat hospital in Kandahar for JSOC, that had kept soldiers alive in conditions where corpses were usually the outcome. This was the part that read vital signs the way other people read weather reports. She was at the nurse's station when Hargrove called. He was at a fundraiser. The event had another 4 hours. Hayes was stable enough to monitor overnight. Check the telemetry every 30 minutes. Call if anything changes. He'd be back in the morning. She looked at the monitors. Pressures rising. Cardiac output dropping. The fluid around Hayes's heart was compressing the ventricle, restricting the chambers, turning a Marine's body into a slow hydraulic failure. Every beat was becoming less efficient. Every breath required more work. He wasn't stable. He was dying. The rhythm of his decline was precise enough to calculate. 3 hours, maybe 4, before the cardiac output dropped below sustainable levels. Maybe 6 before arrest. Unless someone intervened. Unless someone performed a pericardiocentesis, a needle pushed between the ribs into the sac surrounding the heart, aspirating the fluid, buying time. Hargrove had forbidden it. Nurse-level procedures were off-limits. Physician authorization required. Which meant Ashley would stand at the monitors and watch a Marine die because a doctor wanted to protect his fraud scheme. She touched the patch inside her jacket. The faded blue and gold. The insignia of 2nd Battalion. The mark of something she'd been before she was supposed to forget she was anything at all. Her daughter was at home. Asleep. Safe. The life Ashley had rebuilt over 20 years, the anonymity, the quiet, the version of herself that fit into a hospital where no one knew what she actually was. All of it balanced against 5 hours. Maybe less. The time it would take for a Marine to code and die while his 8-year-old daughter slept in the waiting room knowing that someone could have saved him. The choice was simple. Follow orders and let him die. Break every rule she'd been given and save him the way she'd saved him before, in Helmand Province, in a burning building, when survival was the only acceptable outcome. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that saving him would expose her. One unauthorized procedure, one moment of clinical authority, and Hargrove would have the evidence he needed. A nurse acting beyond her scope. A nurse with knowledge that shouldn't exist. A nurse who suddenly had skills that didn't match her credentials. A nurse who was something far more dangerous than insubordinate. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial began like all the others, fluorescent lights casting that particular hospital pallor over everything, the smell of antiseptic layered over something darker underneath, the kind of smell that accumulates when you know people are dying in rooms you can't see. Ashley arrived at 1900 hours to find Hayes had been moved. Not to a standard floor bed. To the ICU. The chart outside his room told the story Hargrove had already written: declining cardiac output, fluid accumulation around the pericardium, the slow suffocation of a heart trapped in its own fluid prison. She read the orders twice. Then read them again, knowing the third reading wouldn't change what they said. No direct patient care for senior chief, documentation duties only. Hargrove's signature at the bottom, dated that morning, probably signed the moment he realized she'd questioned his dosing. Strategic. Calculated. A move designed to keep her competent hands away from Hayes without the messy business of immediate termination. If he pulled her from the patient now, before the board meeting, before he'd orchestrated her complete professional isolation, it might look hasty. But reassigning her to documentation while a patient deteriorated, that was the kind of subtle cruelty that looked like policy. The kind that no one could argue with. The kind that made other nurses nod knowingly, understanding the real message: she was finished. They were just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Ashley stood in the hallway outside Hayes's room, holding the reassignment order. Her jaw worked once, twice, then stopped. Controlled breathing. The kind she'd perfected in places where controlled breathing meant the difference between holding a perimeter and losing it. She folded the paper and walked to the documentation station, where her new computer terminal waited like a sentence. Around her, the evening shift moved in its normal rhythms, phones ringing, monitors beeping their endless songs, people with lives ahead of them rushing past someone whose career was being systematically dismantled by a man in a corner office. At 2,245 hours, she documented medication administration for 17 other patients. Blood work results. Discharge summaries. The work of a clerk, not a nurse with 2 decades of field surgery behind her eyes. She did it all with perfect accuracy, knowing every entry was now evidence that she'd been kept away from direct care. Knowing that when this ended, and it would end, probably by noon tomorrow, Hargrove would point to this very documentation as proof she'd lost her focus, lost her credibility, become the kind of nurse who obsessed over patients and ignored protocol. Hayes's room sat visible from her station, glass walls like a terrarium, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. She could see his numbers from here if she looked, not that Hargrove's orders prevented looking. Just prevented acting. Just prevented her from being the thing between him and whatever came next. At 0200 hours, the monitor's rhythm changed. She heard it before she saw it, a subtle shift in the beeping pattern, the kind of change that meant the heart wasn't pumping as much as it was struggling. Ashley looked up from her computer. The ICU nurse assigned to Hayes, a young man named Derek, maybe 4 years into his career, was checking vitals. He looked calm. He didn't know yet. The numbers didn't show the trap door opening beneath them until it was too late. At 02 for 5 hours, the monitor screamed. Not an alarm, a cascade of alerts, each one stacking on top of the last. Blood pressure dropping. Heart rate climbing, then dropping, then climbing. The kind of chaotic rhythm that meant the heart was running out of room to beat. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid that had been accumulating for days had finally compressed the chambers enough to collapse output entirely. 45 minutes to total organ failure. 30 to loss of consciousness. Maybe less with his underlying trauma. She moved. Not from her chair, from everywhere at once. The documentation screen blinked away. Her body was already walking toward the ICU, already moving the way it moved in Kandahar when a field hospital went from routine to catastrophic, already operating on the muscle memory older than her civilian credentials, older than her carefully constructed identity as just a nurse. Derek was paging Hargrove, his voice tight now, understanding finally what the numbers meant. The ICU attending, a competent woman named Dr. Shen, was already in the room, already calling for the echo machine to confirm what the vital signs were screaming. Ashley appeared in the doorway without being called. Pericardiocentesis. Stat. Not a suggestion. Not a question. The kind of command that came from someone who'd issued them in operating theaters built from sandbags and desperation. Dr. Shen looked up. For a moment, just a moment, nobody moved. The attending was trained, experienced, but she'd never seen a documentation clerk stand in a doorway and issue orders like they came from somewhere deeper than credentials. Then she nodded. Get the kit. Derek was frozen. The paralysis of someone watching the rules he understood collapse in real time. The ICU nurse looked at Ashley, really looked at her, and then moved toward the supply cabinet because the alternative was watching a patient die, and you don't die because of chain of command. The pericardiocentesis kit came open in Ashley's hands with the speed of repetition. Sterile field. Ultrasound probe. The needle, a 22 gauge, long enough, thin enough to slip between ribs without causing more damage than it prevented. She'd done this 47 times in her life. 46 of those had been in Helmand province with dust storms outside and the sound of mortar fire drawing closer while she worked. One more wouldn't change the mathematics of muscle memory. You'll lose your license, Derek whispered. His voice was thin, fractured. He understood what he was witnessing. A nurse breaking the law to save a life. The kind of thing that ended careers. Ashley's hands were already sterile, already positioned. Her voice came out steady as a surgical laser. Then I lose it. The ultrasound screen showed the compression instantly, fluid collection like a dark cloud around the heart, the chambers squeezed into frantic barely beating shapes. She identified the intercostal space at the 5th rib, midclavicular line, the exact space where the needle needed to pass between bone and lung and into the fluid prison surrounding Hayes's dying heart. Her hand entered the space between 2 ribs with the precision of someone who'd done this while the floor shook from distant explosions. The resistance changed. Tissue, then the pericardial sac membrane. Then, the fluid. Gold-tinged blood drew back into the syringe. Just 30 milliliters at first, then 40, then 60. Each milliliter released pressure. Each milliliter gave the heart room to beat again. On the monitor, the chaotic rhythm began to find order. The blood pressure climbed. The color in Hayes's face, which had gone the gray-white of failing circulation, began to shift back toward human. By the time she withdrew the needle, his systolic pressure had climbed from 62 to 87. His oxygen saturation rose. His heart found something that resembled a normal rhythm, the monitor settling into the steady beep of a patient who'd just survived something that should have killed him. She documented everything at 0303 hours with handwriting that didn't waver, knowing every word would be read as evidence. Procedure performed 02 for 7 hours. Indication: cardiac tamponade secondary to pericardial effusion. 45 milliliters fluid evacuated. Patient responsive. Vital signs stabilizing. Signature: A. Cooper, RN. The lie was elegant. She could have written her rank: Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, 20 years of trauma surgery in forward operating bases. Instead she wrote RN, Registered Nurse, which is what the credentials in her file said, what the hospital had been paying her to pretend to be. The gap between those two things was wider than the hospital was equipped to understand. Ashley remained at Hayes's bedside for the next 5 hours, monitoring every vital sign, her presence the sole barrier between him and the second cardiac collapse that would probably kill him. The ICU nurse occasionally brought her coffee, cold by the time she remembered to drink it, the cup leaving a ring on the monitor stand. Dr. Shen had left, had done what needed to be done after the procedure, but Ashley stayed. Watching. Waiting. Her hand resting near the monitor cord, ready to call for help if it went wrong again, understanding with perfect clarity that help wouldn't come in time. At 0600 hours, Hargrove arrived. She heard his footsteps in the corridor before she saw him, the particular cadence of someone accustomed to rooms going quiet when he entered. He read the chart. She watched his face transform from irritation to something far more dangerous: opportunity. He'd been given the termination he wanted. Better, he'd been given the evidence. An unsupervised invasive procedure. A direct violation of the standing orders she'd been given just hours earlier. The exact kind of insubordination that boards understood, that state licensing boards understood, that a jury would understand if it ever came to that. He entered the room without speaking. The fluorescent lights above them hummed their mechanical monotone, that particular sound of institutional indifference that accompanied most human suffering. He stood at the foot of Hayes's bed, looking down at the Marine whose cardiac tamponade had just given him everything he needed. "You just ended your career," he said quietly. Not angry. Satisfied. The way someone speaks when they've won and are simply documenting the victory. Ashley didn't look up from the monitor. Her voice came out exactly the way it had when she'd told Derek what was happening, when she'd given commands in that operating theater outside Kandahar, when she'd been someone other than what her file suggested. Lance Corporal Hayes is alive. That matters more than my license. Hargrove left without responding. He didn't need to. By 0800 hours, her badge had been deactivated. By 0900 hours, security was walking her toward the parking lot with a cardboard box containing her personal items, the morning sun hitting her face with the kind of light that only exists after everything has been taken. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 1400 hours when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize, and a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere deeper than civilian life said exactly 4 words: "We know what you did." Security escort Rodriguez walked 3 paces behind her, eyes fixed on the exit doors of Oak Creek Memorial. Ashley's cardboard box weighed nothing and everything: a coffee mug with a chipped handle, a framed photo of Mia at her 6th birthday, the jacket with the faded unit patch sewn so carefully into the lining that only hands trained in invisible stitching could have done it. The hallway stretched before her like a gauntlet. Colleagues who'd sought her advice for years studied their charts with sudden religious intensity. The break room she'd eaten lunch in for 36 months sat empty, fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished table where they'd laughed about shift rotations and terrible hospital coffee. That was before she'd challenged Dr. Hargrove's orders. Before she'd questioned his judgment in front of a Marine's dying family. Before she'd become the woman nobody could afford to acknowledge. The second-floor tiles clicked under her shoes, rubber-soled comfort model, broken in at the heel, marked for replacement. That's what she was now. Marked for replacement. Her record showed 3 years of civilian nursing, impeccable credentials, strong evaluations, and zero operational experience with emergency procedures. Nothing to explain how her hands had moved with the precision of someone who'd sutured arteries by flashlight under mortar fire, how she'd known exactly where the needle needed to go, how her body had remembered 1,000 procedures her official paperwork pretended she'd never performed. The pericardiocentesis yesterday wasn't her first. It was her 247th. But the one documented in her civilian file would be her last. Rodriguez held the main exit door open. The San Diego sun hit her face like a verdict. Behind them, third floor, Dr. Hargrove watched from his office window, telephone receiver pressed to his ear. She didn't need to see him to know he was smiling. She could feel the satisfaction radiating down from that window like heat shimmer off asphalt. The investigator he'd placed in administration 6 weeks ago had already made the call to the state nursing board, anonymous complaint, submitted electronically, forwarded to 3 board members before sunrise. Hargrove's network was efficient. 5 calls had been made. 3 promises extracted. 1 termination file completed with her name highlighted in institutional yellow. The sloppy unsupervised procedure. The medication she couldn't account for. The patient she'd saved and, by saving him, destroyed her own career. "I'm sorry, Sarge," Rodriguez whispered as he pushed the door wider. She almost smiled. Almost. The composure held like a dam holding back a reservoir. No tremor. No crack. Just the forward momentum of a woman carrying a cardboard box containing everything the hospital had allowed her to be. The parking lot stretched empty in the noon heat. Her car, a 2009 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles and a prayer, waited where she'd left it. Her hands, steady as surgical instruments, placed the cardboard box on the passenger seat. 20 years of combat surgery. 17 deployments. 247 emergency procedures performed in blast tents and field hospitals where the only anesthesia was muscle memory and the certainty that if you didn't move fast enough, a Marine died. All of that, compressed into 3 years of civilian paperwork. Mia was waiting at the kitchen table when Ashley arrived at 1,402 hours. 6 years old, backpack still slung across her shoulders, homework folder open, face bright with the kind of joy children reserve for the end of school days. "Mommy, you're home early." The words came out like an accusation wrapped in confusion. Ashley's hands that had held together the arterial wall of a 19-year-old from Raleigh, hands that had performed a needle decompression on a Marine with a collapsed lung while enemy gunfire splintered the tent poles around them, these hands trembled now. Just once. Just internally. The external composure held perfect and terrified. "Sweetie, come here." Ashley pulled Mia close, breathing in the smell of playground dirt and the strawberry shampoo she'd bought at the commissary. Except commissaries were for families with active military ID. That woman was gone. That identity was erased, buried under official paperwork signed by generals and classified into oblivion. Sometimes jobs end, Ashley heard herself say. Sometimes things change. It's okay. The lie tasted like copper. Like the taste of blood in her mouth after the RPG hit the tent in Kandahar. Like the knowledge that she'd sworn on documents written in blood and classified ink that she would never reveal what happened there, never surface her operational identity, never speak the name of the program that made her disappear. Mia's face crumpled slightly. "Are you sad, Mommy?" "No, baby. Just tired." Ashley held her daughter closer, feeling the small bones of her shoulder, the absolute vulnerability of civilian life. A life she'd built stone by stone to protect this child from the world Ashley had survived. And now that careful construction was collapsing because she'd dared to save someone's life using the only skills she'd ever truly possessed. Hargrove's efficiency was remarkable. By 12:45 hours, before Ashley's vehicle had even exited the hospital parking lot, he'd made the first call to Richard Chen, a board member who'd once sought Hargrove's endorsement for a promotion. By 13:10 hours, he'd called Thomas Bradley, whose son attended a private school that required Hargrove's recommendation letter. By 13:40 hours, the third call went to Patricia Valdez, who'd borrowed $50,000 from Hargrove's personal accounts last year, a loan documented nowhere, interest collected in favors, repayment guaranteed through institutional leverage. The anonymous complaint to the State Nursing Board was filed electronically at 1,402 hours, submitted through a proxy server, routed through 3 email accounts, documented with timestamp stripped copies of hospital procedure logs. Unsupervised cardiac surgery. Medication administration without physician authorization. Reckless endangerment of a patient, whatever the outcome. The investigator positioned in hospital administration, Thompson, an accountant with gambling debts that Hargrove had quietly erased, began assembling the termination file at 1,415 hours. Photographs of the equipment she'd used. Timestamps from the cardiac monitor showing the exact moment her intervention began. Witness statements, already prepared, already signed, already waiting for her name to be added to the official record as someone who'd violated every protocol, exceeded every boundary, and stepped so far beyond her authority that the hospital had no choice but to remove her. At 1,503 hours, the State Board's preliminary review began. By 1,600 hours, a formal inquiry was opened. By 1,700 hours, the email arrived at Ashley's personal account, forwarding her credentials to the Medical Review Division. Temporary suspension pending investigation. Immediate cessation of patient care. Do not return to the facility. Do not contact colleagues. Do not attempt to access hospital systems. Her career was not ending. Her identity was being erased, again. Different uniforms, same methodology. Mia did homework at the kitchen table while Ashley sat across from her, unable to explain why homeschooling might start sooner than planned, unable to tell her daughter that the job her mother had held for 3 careful years was gone, unable to articulate any truth that wouldn't require revealing classified operations and government secrets and the reason her official timeline had 17 years missing from it. Instead, she made pasta. She helped Mia with math problems. She read her daughter's assigned books about friendly neighborhood nurses and heroic first responders, wondering which category she'd actually occupied before the cardboard box removed her from both. By 1842 hours, as darkness began to settle across San Diego like a held breath, Dr. Hargrove's network had activated completely. 3 board members had received their instructions. The State Board had her file. The investigator was preparing media statements. And in a hospital room on the 5th floor of Oak Creek Memorial, Lance Corporal Marcus Hayes was regaining consciousness, taking his first deep breath without fluid in his chest cavity, beginning to wonder who exactly had saved his life and why he was thinking about a woman he'd met once, 20 years ago, when he was 8 years old and his village was burning. But that was the beginning of a different story entirely. That was the moment when everything Hargrove had constructed, every careful call and manipulated board member and anonymous complaint, began to unravel against forces he couldn't control and didn't know were watching him. For now, Ashley sat at her kitchen table with Mia sleeping against her shoulder, unable to cry, unable to explain, unable to do anything except wait in the darkness and remember why she'd been ordered into hiding in the first place. The cardboard box sat by the front door. Inside it, one false life had ended. Outside, in the silence of a San Diego evening, something older was beginning to wake. At 1,700 hours, when the evening light turned the ICU windows to burnished copper, Lance Corporal Marcus Hayes opened his eyes. His first word wasn't Mom or water or where am I. His first word was Reaper. He whispered it to the young nurse checking his vitals, her name tag reading Sarah Chen, her hands trembling slightly as she registered his consciousness. His voice came rough as gravel through a ventilator throat, but it carried weight. Command weight. The kind of voice that had ordered men through fire. Sarah's pen stopped mid-notation on the chart. She leaned in, uncertain if she'd heard correctly. Hayes repeated it, stronger now, his eyes finding hers with the intensity of someone pulling himself back from the very edge of death. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper. If she's here. Tell her. Tell her Reaper made it home. Sarah's hands shook as she scrolled through the chart notes her supervisor had flagged that morning, the ones documenting Hayes's confusion during the fever spike. She read the line that made her breath catch. Patient claims nurse who performed emergency pericardiocentesis is Reaper, same operator who extracted him from Helmand Province Village Massacre, 2004. Patient claims to have been 8-year-old civilian hostage, sole survivor of family unit. Claims extraction was classified JSOC operation. She called the attending physician. The attending called the administrator. The administrator made a phone call that moved up a chain so fast and so high that by 1845 hours, Hospital Director Richard Morrison was reading a faxed file that had arrived unmarked and urgent from the Department of Defense. The first page held a service record. 17 combat deployments. 3 tours in Kandahar. 2 tours in Fallujah. 7 in Helmand Province. The file was thick, pages printed on security paper, every other word redacted, then suddenly unredacted by federal order. Bronze Star. Silver Star for a field surgical operation that lasted 72 hours without break, saving 23 wounded under sustained fire. Navy Cross. The citation alone was 3 paragraphs of language Morrison had never encountered before: extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming force, command of classified asset, direct responsibility for recovery and treatment of wounded across multiple hostile engagements. The hospital board convened emergency session at 2000 hours. Dr. Hargrove sat alone at the defendant's table. He'd arrived confident, still riding the certainty that he'd orchestrated everything perfectly, that a nurse with a sealed record couldn't fight back, that her career was already erasable, that his fraud would evaporate with her credibility. Morrison presented the documentation with the precision of a prosecutor. A Navy file declassified by presidential order. An FBI dossier spanning 6 months of surveillance. The phantom billing codes. The pharmaceutical kickbacks. The charges totaling $847,000 for medications never administered, diagnoses fabricated for terminal patients whose pain medication was being skimmed and resold through a network of 3 other doctors and a pharmacy tech who'd already turned state's evidence. Board member Patricia Song, who'd taken Hargrove's call at 0600 that morning, would not meet his eyes. Board member James Liu, who'd promised to support the dismissal, was studying his shoes. The State Nursing Board investigator received a phone call at 20:30 hours from the Department of Defense. The investigation into Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper was closed effective immediately. All complaints were withdrawn. A formal apology would be issued on record. The investigator sat in his car in the parking lot for 10 minutes after the call ended, realizing he'd been used as a weapon against someone he'd never been trained to see as anything but a problem to solve. By 2200 hours, Dr. Hargrove's medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. His office was sealed. His access card deactivated. His name removed from the department roster with the speed of someone being erased from institutional memory. The break room emptied around him like water down a drain, but this was no longer conspiracy. This was consequence. Dr. Patel walked past him in the hallway at 2245 hours and didn't break stride. Nurse Martinez turned her back when he tried to speak. The same staff members who'd abandoned Ashley in her hour of humiliation now abandoned him in his, but the mathematics of isolation were different. Where Ashley's isolation had been orchestrated and cruel, Hargrove's was earned and absolute. Every person who'd participated in his campaign against her now understood they'd been used to enforce a lie. Every person who'd stayed silent now felt the weight of that silence. Rodriguez, the security guard, arrived at Hargrove's office at 0800 hours the next morning, cardboard box in his hands, the same box he'd carried to the break room when he escorted Ashley out. Dr. Hargrove, Rodriguez said, his voice flat and professional in the way of someone delivering words he'd been given. I believe you know the way out. Hargrove's hand shook as he packed diplomas that no longer meant what they did yesterday. Medical journals he would never publish in again. The framed photograph of himself with the mayor at a fundraiser, now evidence of a life destroyed by someone too arrogant to understand that greed and intelligence are not the same thing. He walked out of Oak Creek Memorial at 08 for 7 hours on a Tuesday morning in September. The same automatic doors that had opened for him thousands of times slid shut behind him like a gate closing. He didn't look back. 18 months later, the sun rose over Camp Pendleton in dress whites and golds, and Ashley Cooper stood in navy dress blues for the first time in 20 years. The uniform felt like coming home. Like remembering who she'd been when she was allowed to be that person. The senior chief petty officer insignia on her sleeve caught the light as she moved forward to pin new stripes on Lance Corporal Marcus Hayes, who was no longer a Lance Corporal but a sergeant, who'd healed from cardiac tamponade into a man strong enough to lead Marines again. His 8-year-old daughter stood at the edge of the ceremony, watching her father receive promotion from a woman whose name had lived in his heart for 20 years as the voice that pulled him from fire. She didn't understand yet that her father had been 8 when Ashley, then called Reaper, moving through Helmand Province with the precision of a surgeon and the decisiveness of a combat operator, had extracted him from a village where his family had been killed and he was the only child left breathing. The girl would grow up knowing that her father's life was saved by a woman in a Navy uniform who smiled when she pinned those stripes. The investigation that followed Hargrove's collapse led to 14 arrests. 3 other doctors. 2 hospital administrators. The pharmacy tech who'd been reselling opioids. The DEA eventually recovered pharmaceutical inventory worth more than $2 million. Hospital policy reformed. A new compliance office opened. Every terminal patient's file was audited. 18 months of criminal justice moving at its inexorable pace, and at the end of it, Ashley's name was cleared with prejudice, her termination retroactively voided, and her back pay restored with interest. She returned to Oak Creek Memorial as Director of Emergency Medicine. The faded 2nd Battalion patch that had lived inside her jacket lining for 20 years now hung framed on her office wall. It sat beside a commendation she was finally allowed to acknowledge, a photograph from a ceremony she'd attended in 2004 that had been classified until now, and a handwritten note from Marcus Hayes that simply read, "She brought me home." Dr. Hargrove taught CPR classes at San Diego Community College for minimum wage, the terms of his plea agreement. He moved through those classes like a ghost haunting a place that had rejected him, demonstrating chest compressions to bored students who didn't know his name used to mean something. Didn't know he'd once had the power to destroy people. Didn't know he'd used that power against someone braver than he would ever be. Ashley received a text from Mia, now 10 years old, who'd learned to ride a bicycle on the day her mother was escorted from the hospital, who'd asked why the nice nurse didn't visit anymore, who'd spent 18 months confused about why her mother cried at her kitchen table. The text read, "Mom, my teacher wants you to speak at Career Day about being a Navy nurse." Ashley touched the framed patch on her office wall. Remembered the 8-year-old boy screaming in Helmand. Saw the grown Marine sergeant he'd become. Thought of all the lives saved by hands that had never stopped being a warriors even when the world had demanded she pretend otherwise. She texted back, "Tell your teacher yes." The hospital corridor where she'd been escorted out in disgrace now filled with staff members seeking her expertise, asking her advice, standing when she entered a room. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal mechanical song, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded beneath them, but the meaning of that space had changed. It had become a place where doing the right thing mattered. Where quiet strength was finally visible. Where a woman who'd been erased could stand in the light again. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you've ever been isolated for telling the truth, subscribe and drop a comment telling me your story. What would you have done in Ashley's position? Like this video, because the heroes operating in silence deserve to be seen, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story about the ones who saved us when nobody was watching.